I want to welcome you to Bond House. My name is Melody Barnes. I'm the Executive Director of the Karsh Institute of Democracy, and I am thrilled to welcome you to our last Touchstones of Democracy series event for this semester. We are very, very excited about this. For those of you who've been here before, you know that this is an event that's sponsored by our Nau Lab, and it's done in partnership with the College and Graduate School of Arts and Sciences here at UVA. I think for those of you who have been here before during the fall, you know that we have been focusing on the 250th, focusing on the semi-quincentennial this year. And we think that this series is a wonderful opportunity to give all of us a chance to reflect on the 250 years since the Declaration of Independence was written, since the Revolution, and to think about the different ways that the themes of the Revolution and the issues of that period are important to us today, as well as what happened during that particular time. I'm particularly excited, and I was just saying this to Doug and to Zara, that today we are focusing on art. I think often people don't think about art when they think about these moments of political transformation, but I, for one, think that it is exceedingly important. Excuse me, and if you go back and you think about the work of Frederick Douglass, and you think about Jefferson and others, they talk about the role of the arts and the fact that places aren't necessarily just changed by bullets and by spears. They are changed by images and the way that we think about ourselves and our culture and these moments through images. So this is, I think, a particularly exciting moment to help us think about that moment of challenge and our democracy today. We are thrilled to have our conversation focus on this really powerful theme and do that through the lens of the work of Zara Anishanslin. In her new book, The Painter's Fire, A Forgotten History of the Artist Who Championed the American Revolution. And she does this, and I won't, Cliff Note version, I'm not going to give you a spoiler alert here, but she does this through the intertwined stories of three artists and shows how their creative work helped articulate the values and aspirations of this period as we were going through, as this country at that point, the 13 colonies were going through this big period of political transformation. As I've said to Zara, we are thrilled to have you here at the Karsh Institute. She comes to us from the University of Delaware, where she's an associate professor of history and art history, and she's a leading scholar of America and the Atlantic world. Zara has deep expertise in material culture, public history, and the visual dimensions of political life. Her award-winning first book, Portrait of a Woman in Silk, reimagined the connections among art and empire and identity. And for her new work, she had fellowships at many renowned institutions, including the Royal Archives at Windsor Castle, Princeton's Davis Center, and she's collaborated widely with museums and institutes to share academic scholarship with public audiences. You are truly a public scholar, so thank you for that. She also co-hosts a podcast, Thing for Things, and I have to mention this because, if any time you get to mention Hamilton, you got to take it. She served as the material culture consultant for Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton, the Exhibition. So thank you for being with us. Guiding today's conversation is our colleague, Douglas Fordham, who's chair of UVA's Department of Art. Professor Fordham is a distinguished historian of British art, whose scholarship has reframed how we understand the intersections of empire and visual culture and global encounter. His books, Art and the British Empire, British Art and the 7 Years' War, and Aquatint Worlds have shaped the field and continue to influence studies of 18th century art and politics. He's currently at work on a new project that explores the metaphysics of British painting in the 18th century. And I have to tell you, when I hear things like that, I think I want to go back to college and I want to change my major. So I'm fascinated by your work and really appreciative of your being here with us today. So with that, I'm going to say that Zara's book is available for purchase. I'm sure when this is over, those of you who don't have it will rush to to purchase her book. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you all for the conversation. Again, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Well, I'm so pleased to be here in discussion of The Painter's Fire. And I'm going to give it just a very brief introduction, just to set some of the primary characters, and then we can jump into the Q&A.
Can you send this to me later so I can use it for
Yeah,
future time?
yeah, I'll use this is a history that draws a surprisingly fresh and unexpected portrait of what an American patriot might look like in the transatlantic sphere of the 1770s. When I teach students about the visual culture of the American Revolution, I have typically turned to the big names that you would think of: Benjamin West, John Singleton Copley, John Trumbull. These were men who made these grand machine history paintings filled with our founding fathers with tricorn hats. And you can, I think, easily pull those images to mind that hang today in the Capitol and elsewhere. The Painter's Fire introduces us to three artists who possessed a much more complex relationship to American liberty and to fine art practice, because they're not typical artists in the same way, or they're not fine artists perhaps in the same way that those painters I just mentioned are. So the three main characters and that are going to be coming up in our conversation are Patience Wright, who was an American-born sculptor in wax. She was kind of a Madame Tussauds avant la lettre. And she exhibited both in America and in England. Prince Dima was born into slavery in Massachusetts, where he demonstrated a talent for drawing and actually eventually earned passage to London, where he trained as a portrait painter. An extraordinary story that was completely unknown to me before I read this book. And then Robert Edge Pine, who was an artist that I was familiar with because he was a friend of Hogarth, friend and contemporary of William Hogarth, the great progress painter and modern life painter in England in the 18th century, was the artist that took Prince Dima in as a student and then himself eventually immigrated to the United States. And there's some possibility that he had some African descent in his own lineage, which might have made him more open and willing to train someone like Prince Dima. So The Painter's Fire tells a gripping story of how the lives of these three artists intertwined with one another, as well as with a whole other larger cast of character, many of whom we really know very well: Benjamin Franklin, the poet Francis Wheatley, and others. While many of the works by Dima, Wright, and Pine have been lost or destroyed, and this is something that might, this is a story of loss as much as it is just illustrations of things that we can easily find in museums. The Painter's Fire produces vivid portraits of all three artists and the contributions that they made to American independence through their art. So that's all I'm going to say about the plot lines. That's okay. So I thought I would open with I'd be curious to hear how you came to this topic, and maybe when did you first kind of begin to think, oh, this might be a story of these three intertwined, but also very kind of obscure figures or unfamiliar figures in the history of art, but especially in the history of the American Revolution.
Yeah, so I will start by saying thank you all for being here, and thank you, Douglas, and thank you for the kind introduction. I know there are a million other places you could be, especially this time of the semester, so I don't take the gift of your time lightly. And I will say that if you see my book, it has an orange flame on the front, and so this is why I have this orange skirt, but today it's very cavalier orange, so it works perfectly. So I'm delighted to be here. So I'm going to start by saying that this idea came to me 10 years ago, and I want to emphasize that because I think it's important in our cultural moment to emphasize that sometimes history and art history takes time to produce. Sometimes research, especially transatlantic research, as was alluded to in my introduction, this research unfolded on both sides of the Atlantic, and that takes time. So I also was raising two human children who have now left my nest, so that was also a little bit of a time suck, but I don't regret that, to say the least. But so this idea first came to me in 2015 when the Metropolitan Museum of Art had recently acquired a work identified by Paula Bagger, who works with the Hingham Historical Society, to be that of Prince Dima, or as they term him in the Met used to, Prince Dima Barnes, who was this enslaved portrait painter born in Massachusetts to a woman who was taken from Africa as a child, and this is why he has the name Dima. It is a West African surname. It's also a girl's first name. Whether it was her last name or first name, we don't know, but she gave him that name in a very unusual naming pattern for an enslaved person of a double name. And so I think she was really instrumental in getting his talent recognized to their mutual enslavers, Henry and Christian Barnes, who saw his talent and against all odds, this is a very unusual story, decided to have him sent to London to get training because John Singleton Copley wouldn't train him in Boston on account of his race. And so this is this extraordinary story. And I was in the Met with a bunch of students. I was teaching at CUNY at the time. And it was in the American wing where there's the huge portrait of Washington crossing the Delaware, which you can probably all picture in your mind's eye, and John Trumbull's, iconic portraits, all the things that you alluded to. And this portrait by Prince Dima does not look like those other portraits. We don't use the term folk art anymore, but it looks like what you think of when you think of folk art. And it's also just deeply symbolic and just arresting. And I thought, why is this portrait hung amongst all these heroic, romanticized images? And when I read the story of the artist himself, I thought this would make a really great movie, or possibly a book, although if anyone is a movie maker, let me know, because I'd love to go there.
Still optioning rights.
Yes, exactly. But the transatlantic element is what drew me in as well, because I thought how amazing that this is a story of the American Revolution, because Prince Dima ends up self-emancipating. His enslavers were loyalists and enlisting to fight for the Massachusetts militia on the side of the Patriots. So, he is someone who is doing this out of his attachment to the cause of liberty, that he is not someone like George Washington who has land interests out west that might be affecting his decisions. He is someone who could have left with the British forces and maybe been guaranteed his freedom in a way that would have been more uncertain in Massachusetts, but he decides to stay and fight for the American cause. And Robert Edge Pine, who trained him in London and likely was of African descent, but the family was passing as white, although there were persistent rumors that they were of African descent. He was someone who, despite living in Britain for the entirety of the war, was so taken by the cause, the idealistic cause, that first paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, idealistic cause, that he threw his lot in with the Americans and in Britain itself, used art to send pro-American messages during the war, which lost him a lot of patronage. And he eventually emigrated to the United States after the war, as Douglas mentioned, and set up the first grand art museum in Philadelphia, where he wanted to chronicle the great paintings of the American Revolution. So he is someone who represents, I think, the long line of immigrants who follow him and continue to this day, of people who were drawn to America by its promise of liberty and how it could change their lives. And so I thought these two people, that is just amazing, and what a story, and what a stirring story about the American Revolution. And I always like to include a woman as a key historical actor in my work, because women are half of history, but we're not usually half of history as a genre or a field. And when I realized that Patience Wright, the wax sculptor, who is one of the wackiest historical characters you'll ever run into, more on that later, when I realized that she had social and artistic connections to Robert Edge Pine, I was like, okay, here is, and she again, in Britain for the entirety of the war, working as a spy for the American cause. I thought, here's a story about these three patriots who are all not the founders we're used to picturing, right? Not the patriots we're used to picturing, but they are out there engaged in fighting for the cause of liberty and fighting for the independence of the new United States in very unusual places and in idiosyncratic ways. And I thought, this is a story that I felt like these characters deserve their story to be told, because they have been largely forgotten. And I wanted to give them their historical due by telling their stories.
Great. Patience Wright, you open your book with talking about she in 1780, she exhibits the severed head of Charles I, King Charles I, in the London exhibition. This would have been a very fraught kind of thing to do at a moment when England was losing to the American colonies, and monarchy might have felt a little bit precipitous or
threatened.
threatened. So, that comes the question about Patience Wright. She's a very bold woman, and that as that. How much personal risk was she running? Do you think professional or personal risk that she was running during those war years? That when she's in London, openly espousing patriot views, pro-American views.
Yeah, so she's a really interesting character. She's born in Long Island, and she has a very sort of traditional, early motherhood, child-raising type period of her life. Her husband dies. I don't think she was too sad about it because she later recalls that the only things he had to recommend him were his age and his fortune. So, but she decides to reinvent herself, and along with her sister, they open a wax museum in Philadelphia and a wax museum in New York. And how they learned to make wax sculptures, we don't know. They claim when they were little, they modeled figures out of clay and dough, and they become very successful. Her wax museum in New York burns down, and she makes the very bold decision to recoup her losses by going to London and opening a wax museum there. And so she opens this wax museum in Pall Mall, which is at the center of the sort of political, social heart of London. And she comes with a letter of introduction to Benjamin Franklin from his sister Jane, which gives her entree to Franklin. Franklin thinks she's a genius, and she opens this wax museum. Pretty soon she's modeled the wax heads of King George and Queen Charlotte, who she cheekily calls George and Charlotte to their faces. And when the American War comes, she is someone who you would think is in a very good position to keep her mouth shut and not say anything. Because she's an American, she has made money out of this wax museum. She's been there since 1772. Her son is a student in the Royal Academy of Art. Her two daughters are with her working in the wax museum. But she's a patriot, and when news of the Battle of Lexington and Concord in 1775 crosses the Atlantic, she is one of many Americans living in Britain at the time, because of course there are many of them, because it's part of the empire, who is completely outraged by the fact that the British crown would shed the blood of their colonial subjects. And so she allegedly, there's no archival documentation for this, but she allegedly marches up to King George and yells at him for the Battle of Lexington and Concord. I don't know whether that's true, but the fact is that a couple of years later, when one of her daughters marries an artist who's widely rumored to be the illegitimate son of George III. These are artists, they're great, they have all these amazing backstories. The king had been giving this man an allowance since his early childhood, and the day after he married Patience Wright's daughter, he cuts him off. So there was some animosity between the king and Patience Wright. But so she has a lot to lose, but she decides to not only be bold, she makes these political statements with her wax museums. She puts a figure of an American indigenous person and his wife in the display, sort of the classic America's Indian princess that's a trope at the time, to show that this is an American space. She operates an international spy ring out of the museum. I don't know how good she was, because at one point in the British Library, I was reading letters from the sort of 18th century version of MI6, and they say, we found another one of Mrs. Wright's letters to Benjamin Franklin in France, but the information's actually really wrong, so we're going to let it go through. But I think she was more successful in the letters that she shipped back across the Atlantic in wax heads to her sister Rachel, who put them on display in the wax museum she ran in Philadelphia, not far from where Continental Congress met, and passed on to members of the Continental Congress. So I elaborate on all this because she's not just speaking out about the American Revolution and her attachment to the Patriot cause. She's actively engaged in espionage. And something that doesn't get talked a lot about in the American Revolution is, in terms of a North American-centric version of it, is that there was a Treason Act of 1777, which was put in place in England. And it was something that outraged people on all ends of the political spectrum. People as far apart, those of you who know your politics, as Edmund Burke and John Wilkes both came together to say this is abhorrent because it was aimed at people who were engaged in pro-American activities, either in America, elsewhere, or on the Atlantic, and said that if you were found engaging in anti-British, pro-American activities, you could be imprisoned indefinitely at the king's pleasure, as they put it, without due process. The right to habeas corpus was suspended. And this was something that had never been done in any treason act up until then, including when the Jacobites rebelled in the 1740s. So she could have been hauled into prison and left there, indefinitely. And yet she persisted in doing this. And she's this wonderful character because she is friendly with the great and the good. She's friendly with Benjamin Franklin. She's writing letters to Thomas Jefferson. Has this sort of love-hate relationship with John Adams. Abigail Adams can't stand her. She calls her the queen of sluts at one point. But she's very well connected with all of these people. And she writes to John Dickinson at some point and says, "Women are always useful in grand events. Use me to help the American cause. I'm here in London. I can be your eyes and ears on the ground. I can go to Parliament. I can listen to people at my wax museum." And she has people like Lord North and Lord Dunmore dropping by to chat with her, right? So she's very well connected. And to me, she's a reminder that we tend to think of Abigail Adams as being this outlier saying, "Remember the ladies, John," and when in fact, Abigail's just one of many women who are active political participants during the American Revolution. And Patience Wright, I think, is a dramatic example of that.
Great. Yeah, there's a wonderful kind of literature on 18th century kind of proto-political spaces, or so we can think of the coffee house in London where people would debate, even if they didn't have a vote, they could debate politics, or the argument around the French salons where you could mount very, very subtle critiques of the monarchy, perhaps, in history painting and have people recognize it as such. Since this is a democracy series, and I wanted to make sure that, but I'm curious about having finished this project. Are there additional kinds of proto-political spaces within the arts that we need to be thinking of as more kind of central to or having more potential for democratic interaction, or in an 18th century space where very few people had the vote?
Yeah, I love that question because I do think that these artist circles give us insight into artistic spheres as proto-political places, much like a salon. And a lot of the work that's been done, understandably, focuses on things like the Republic of Letters and a sort of conversational exchange of ideas. And I think art does the same thing. Art also converses. Art also creates and transmits ideology. And we just don't tend to think of it as doing the same work, but it very much is. And thinking of these people in particular, for example, Patience Wright's wax museum in London and her sisters in Philadelphia absolutely were serving as political spheres. So they were places where you could see through the statues that were there. So Patience Wright, for example, included figures like William Pitt, the Earl of Chatham, who was thought by Americans probably to be more pro-American than he actually was, but was one of their darling political heroes. John Wilkes, Benjamin Franklin. Once the Battle of Lexington and Concord comes, she not only puts in the two Indigenous American figures, but she puts in a tableau of the biblical story of Esther saving her people from the machinations of an evil minister and a deluded king, which has obvious implications for what's happening in the British Empire at the time. And so not only do you have people coming and exchanging gossip in what they know is a museum run by a pro-American person, and it's a sort of spy nexus, but it's also a place where people will come and be influenced by the art that they're seeing. And similarly, you can think of Robert Edge Pine's studio, which is in St. Martin's Lane, which is the epicenter of artistic training in the British Empire, really, not just London. And in his studio, where he's training people like John Hamilton Mortimer, who's a famously little R Republican British award-winning artist. He's training Prince Dima, who we've already mentioned is someone who self-emancipates and enlists to fight for the Patriots. And so as these people together are working on their art, we know that they're having conversations about politics that get translated into the art. So for example, when Robert Edge Pine is training Prince Dima in 1770 to 1771, he's working on one of these massive history paintings. So picture again the things in the Capitol Rotunda, right? But it's the scene of the Earl of Warren from the 13th century. 18th century people loved their medieval history lessons. The Earl of Warren brandishing his sword against the tyrannical King Edward, who was trying to seize his property without a warrant. And this has obvious implications, for what's unfolding on the other side of the Atlantic. And the fact that this is what Prince Dima would have been trained, he would have been painting the draperies. He would have been helping Robert Edge Pine with the sort of background materials as a means of his artistic training. And I would give anything to time travel and be a fly on that wall and, hear what the two men were discussing in terms of politics, not just their shared attachment to republicanism and the American patriot cause, but that they are two men of, we know for certainty and very likely of African descent, maneuvering in this world where liberty and equality are being discussed in ways they never have been before. So those are also, smaller political spheres, but they're political spheres nonetheless. And then Robert Edge Pine, during the war, he and Patience Wright both spend their summers, and Robert Edge Pine spends even more time in Bath. And Bath itself can be seen as a sort of political sphere of pro-American ideology within Britain itself during the war, because you have Robert Edge Pine, you have Patience Wright, you have Catherine Macaulay, the female British historian who is very pro-Republican. This is not in any of her history books, but an American visiting London at one point was having dinner with her and said that he admired her books, which are very pro-Republican, anti-monarchical in certain ways. And she said, well, this is a time for us to talk about what should happen next, because King Charles I was bad, but George III is worse. So, this is something that would ring very, very stirringly to Americans' ears. So I think you can even think about the spa town of Bath and the artists and the intellectuals who are moving through it as a political sphere. And so we should think about this art as political. And this should be, this makes sense for us today, right? Because any political protest you see news coverage of, there are signs and pictures and images. And so, I think we just don't tend to think of art as one of the primary drivers, but it definitely is.
I'm trying to think about how to ask this exactly, because it's kind of a roundabout question, but portraiture is such a huge part of 18th century art, right? And in the Anglo-American world, and it's almost always associated with politeness, with codes of propriety and bearing, and then to read this story about Prince Dima being enslaved and creating portraits under the conditions of slavery, and then to have Christian Barnes kind of patronizing him by sending him off to London to be trained, but retaining him not freeing him to go do that, but sending him as a slave to be trained, presumably so he could come back and work for her. It feels like under the pressure of this story, the politeness of portraiture just kind of crumbles.
Yes.
And I just kind of want to get here. This is not a great question, but I'm wondering, like, what do we learn anything new about American art or portraiture, through the pressure of that story?
Absolutely. So one of the things that I like to emphasize is that for Prince Dima, it sort of flips the story we think about in terms of American patriotism on its head, because the reason that he is freed is that his enslavers are loyalists, and they're not hypocrites. So lots of people in the Massachusetts area will sign a non-importation agreement in the wake of the Stamp Act or the Townsend Duties, and they'll continue to smuggle goods in. John Hancock, for example, does this. But the Barneses are loyalist, and they are staunchly devoted to the crown, and they are not hypocritical about it, which means that Henry Barnes, the husband, is constantly called out in town meetings, in newspapers, and he's one of maybe 5 people who get called out continually. And this has a very dramatic effect on their lives, enslaved and free, in the Barnes household. Because among other things, a horse is tarred and feathered to send a message to the Barneses, which is the only time, to my knowledge, that an animal was tarred and feathered during the American Revolution. And if you think about a horsehair and tarring, it's, awful. So after a series of events like that, the Barneses leave for Nova Scotia and then England, where they spend the rest of their life, having lost all their property. Their property is seized, including the portraits that Prince Dima has done of them and of their ward and Christian's niece. And they are given over to the use of General Henry Knox and his wife, Lucy. And Christian Barnes is very upset about this because she's been friends with Lucy Knox, and she said, Lucy Knox knows better than to use my piano and my furniture and my portraits. But the reason the portraits come into this is both Christian Barnes and Prince Dima's mother use the portraits not as sort of symbols of gentility, which is what they were originally created to be, right? That we have the wealth and the gentility to have these lovely portraits done. but they use them as symbols of remembrance of what they've lost and the things that they've lost because of their different political choices. So Prince Dima dies in 1778, likely because he contracted smallpox and died shortly after he enlisted to fight in the Massachusetts militia. His mother keeps the portraits that he had made, at least some of them. She keeps the one of Chrissy, who's the ward of the Barneses. And Christian Barnes writes to her from exile in England and says, "Your son's portrait of Chrissy can be of no use to you now that he's gone. Can you please send me my niece's portrait?" And Daphne, the formerly enslaved woman who is the mother of the artist, says, "No, this is my son's work and I'm keeping it because my son is dead and I want to keep this as a remembrance of him." And I think it's a really powerful statement about using portraits as memory devices, not just symbol, that they have many uses beyond what they were created to be. And in the case of the portraits of Christian and Henry that Prince Dima makes, Christian's is a copy of a Copley, most likely. Henry's is done from life, and to me, it really captures the tense relationship between enslaver and enslaved, because there's something about his gaze that is very imperious and chilling, I think. But the two portraits end up being commandeered by the Patriots, never get back in the Barnes' hands, and they, I think, are a symbol of the fact that the tarred and feather horse should be more in our common collective memory about the American Revolution, because we tend to think of it as not as violent as other revolutions, when in fact violence always simmered below the surface. The threat of violence always simmered below the surface. And those portraits become transformed from objects of gentility and the artist's talent to mementos of this violence, because they have stab marks through their hearts, because when the Patriots came to seize the house, they bayoneted the portraits as an act of destruction against the loyalists' bodies they could no longer get a hold of. And so I think, in this case, you can think of the portraits as being enacted upon not just by the sitter and the painter, but by ordinary soldiers and by a previously enslaved woman who held onto this portrait, in an act of attachment to her dead son. So I think we can also think about art as doing a lot more than what it is doing in its first stage of life.
I'm going to ask one more and then we'll open it up. Is that kind of good time-wise? Okay. So this is going to be kind of a historiographic question, which is the subtitle is A Forgotten History. And I'm wondering if it's also not, are there historiographic reasons why art history and history might have kind of willfully overlooked this story? Because in a sense, these figures in these archives they've been about, they've been ready, they've been found. Robert Edge Pine is known to some people, but he's just a peripheral figure in England. And so, what might be the disciplinary reasons for why this story had yet to be written until you kind of picked it up?
Well, I will say that A Forgotten History was what Harvard's marketing team wanted to use. So as a scholar, I probably would have hedged that a little bit, because, they're not properly forgotten entirely, because after all, I started by saying that, I got the inspiration for this by visiting the Met, which is not exactly a backwater institution. So there's that to be said. However, I think they have been forgotten in both the historical and the art historical canon as a connected story. And I think the reason for that is, first and foremost, is a lot of their art does not survive. And so art historians don't usually like to analyze art that's no longer there, right? And I'm a material culture person, and there's a lot of talk about the material turn, and I think I coined this phrase, actually. Someone was just asking me this the other day, but I think we need to pay attention to something called the immaterial turn, and to realize that there's a lot of there's a lot of architecture, a lot of art, a lot of all sorts of objects from shoes to chairs that no longer survive, but that were once part of the historical record. And we need to think about those things that don't survive except in archival references as well. And so one of the things that I love historiographically about this book is I hope it reminds people that we need not just to think about what's in the museum and what's in the archive, but what's not in the museum and what's not in the archive. And to spend careful attention to, you alluded to the portrait that opens the book. I mean, this, I think, is one of the most incendiary political, artistic statements from the American Revolution, but I think I'm the first person to talk about it because it no longer exists. So it's a portrait done by Joseph Wright, who's a Royal Academy trained artist, one of the first Americans to study there. He's the daughter of the wax sculptor Patience Wright. And he paints a portrait of his mother modeling a head, a finished head on her lap, and it's the decapitated head of King Charles I. And looking down at her work are busts of King George and Queen Charlotte. So this was exhibited in the Royal Academy annual show, 1780, so 5 years after the war started. And the King and Queen were both there because it was the dedication year of the new home of the Royal Academy. So everyone knew this was a threat of regicide, and it talked about a previous regicide. And for those of you who aren't art historians, this is a juried show. You can't just roll in and hang your painting on the wall, right? It has to pass a jury of experts. And when people talked about it in the papers afterwards, some people, of course, were like, this is awful and treasonous. How did this get into the show? And then other people were like, well done, Joseph Wright. An entertaining defense of constitutional liberties and a reminder that our American brethren are fighting the good fight across the water. And I was just thinking, this is amazing to me that this is in the Royal Academy, the King and Queen are there, and this portrait passes a jury and gets hung on the wall, right? It's disappeared because it probably was lost at sea. Mm-hmm. But so I use it as a metaphor for the fact that just because we know that shipwrecks are under the ocean, even if we can't see them, right? And this art is sort of metaphorically submerged, just as these histories of Black founders and women founders and British inhabitants of, the empire for the duration of the war founders exist. And just because they're submerged doesn't mean we can't pull them up and tell their stories. And so historiographically speaking, I see this as maybe an act of recovery more than, they're not entirely forgotten. But the reality of the fact that a lot of their art, weirdly, Robert Edge Pine's paintings in America and Patience Wright's wax sculptures, a lot of them went up in the same fire in Boston in a museum. So this is why I love being a historian. You can't make this stuff up, right? If I wrote this in a script, people would be like, that's just too pat. That can't happen, but it did. So a reminder that, we need to think about, in much the same way that a lot of Black feminist scholars have asked us to look at absences in the archives related to enslaved women in particular, we need to ask the same questions about art and museums. And I think as we approach the 250th, it's really important to do that because we're going to see a lot of what's there. How many times have you already seen Washington crossing the Delaware? How many times have you already seen the Trumbull painting that is supposed to be of George Washington and William Lee? And I have a side project where I talk about the fact that is not William Lee, and it does his memory a disservice to constantly present him in this stereotyped, racialized way. So, to think about what we're not seeing as well as what we are seeing. And so I hope that this book makes people stop and think about not just what's in the museum, but what's not in the museum and why that matters.
Terrific. Well, I think this is a great spot to open it up to questions from all of you. And we have microphones in the back too, so we're gonna ask you to use that if you don't mind. We have someone up here.
So you're talking about what isn't seen, but what will be seen, do you think, in this 250th year? Or do you find some of these things being focused on as we approach this in major museums or anywhere?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are doing great work with exhibitions. I got to be a consultant for the Concord Museum in Massachusetts, which, for obvious reasons, started their 250th in 2025 because they could capitalize on 1775. And the exhibition that I helped consult on there was called Whose Revolution? ? And it aimed to go beyond the familiar story of the Battle of Lexington and Concord and talk about Indigenous histories, women's histories, Black histories that were layered into Concord as a place over the centuries, but also Concord as a moment in time in 1775. And they did this, I think, in a really wonderful way. I don't know if any of you got to see the show. They're now on to their next show, but I think they did this in a wonderful way because they brought out unfamiliar objects related to these histories, but they also brought out really familiar objects like, a high-style, Chippendale-style bookcase and cabinet type thing, and used it to tell the story of the enslaved man who labored in the house, not the white person who owned it. And they have silhouettes of enslaved figures in their period room installations, and they have artwork by contemporary indigenous artists that are installed before you even go into the exhibition space. So you are immediately thinking about the fact, instead of a sort of, land acknowledgement, it's a sort of indigenous people are still here and they're still making art. And so I thought that was one example of how people, one early harbinger of how people are looking at the revolution in different ways and using art and objects to do it. And I think it's important because it reminds us, and this is what I hope historiographically my book contributes to, a broader historiography that reminds us that America's always been diverse from the start, and the founders were diverse, and the revolutionary Atlantic was diverse, and it's just a fallacy to discuss it as if it was not. So, and I think exhibitions have the room to do that in really immediately compelling ways, because this is one reason I do material culture. People love to look at stuff, right? They love to. I think stuff has an immediacy that is more accessible sometimes than having to read an entire 300 whatever page book to get at the point.
I'll just yell it out, that's okay. So much is available with your computer. Everything's digitized. You have all these databases you can access. I'm curious, in the research for your book, what kind of traveling did you have to do? Where did you go?
Oh, yeah. So the question was, what kind of traveling did I have to do? And I will say, I'll rephrase it as what I got to do, because that was an excellent part of it. I joke that one of the reasons I do transatlantic history and art history is because I like to go to Europe. So, so it gives me a chance to go. So yes, I did a lot of research. I did some research in Paris because this book does have a Parisian element to it. And among other things, Patience Wright goes over to Paris, as does her son, because at some point they do feel it's a little too hot to handle in Britain with their politics. And she finds, ironically, given Madame Tussauds' later career, she finds that there's no appetite for a full-on wax museum in Paris. But so she does try, and among other things, she at one point is stopped at the border between the suburbs and the city of Paris, because she'd been to visit Franklin in Passy, and she'd modeled a new wax head of him. And the guards stopped her because they thought that she'd murdered Ben Franklin, was carrying his decapitated head back into the city. And she didn't speak French, so she had to yell at them until an American who spoke French got there. But so that was fun to do that research in Paris. But the research in England was in Bath, and that was a lot of thinking about the space as a political space and an artistic space. And then the British Library, the Royal Archives, at Windsor Castle, which was fantastic, which was in the round turret at the castle. And the British Library, as I mentioned, the Royal Academy of Arts, which has an amazing archive. And then in the US, a lot of research at places from, Mount Vernon to, the Massachusetts Historical Society. And I would like to say, in answer to your question, that in doing all that travel and writing these books and doing this research, you really rely so much on the talents and the skills of curators and archivists and librarians. And when I say that I found a letter in the British Library, I mean that I found it myself, but it was carefully placed there by someone and cared for by an archivist and a librarian. And so I just want to acknowledge all the people who make our research possible, because without these caretakers of these things, we wouldn't be able to travel and see them.
Person with the microphone in the back there.
Sorry, you're right. You mentioned a lot about forgotten art and stuff. Do you think with all the digital digitalized stuff and AI and stuff, has there been an effort to re-examine this art? Because I would imagine there's a lot of letters and stuff.
Yeah, so you were totally just reading my mind, because when this gentleman asked me that question, the first thing I thought was, digital, I never thought about this. I wonder if we could recreate any of this art, because that would be amazing. So yeah, I think that would be a really cool project. So people have done things like, some people at CUNY did a project where they recreated P.T. Barnum's museum that burned to the ground in New York in the 19th century. And they did it using 3D, digital technology. And as he was asking the question, I was thinking to myself, I was like, oh, I wonder if I could, give AI the directive of Patience Wright, decapitated head of Charles I, busts of George and Charlotte, and if it could create a cool portrait for me that would look like it. So yeah, I kind of love that idea. And that is something I think we should explore, because I think there are ways to use, there's a lot of talk about AI and its limitations and its problematic nature, but I think that also, in much the same way that Wikipedia when it started was problematic, but also has potential and has a use, I think we could think about AI and particularly 3D printing in that way, that I think there are ways it can be really great. And resuscitating this vanished art might be one way to do it. Because I will say, one of the things that Patience Wright did not get to do, because she died before she could do it, and it makes me very sad, because I so wish that this existed, and I wish we could have this as a 250th. And again, if anyone wants to take this on as a project, I will work with you. So what she wanted to do was, she wanted to go back to America, and she wanted to make a life-size gallery of wax figures of the founders to put in what is now Independence Hall. So if she'd had her way, you could have gone to Philadelphia and visited Independence Hall and seen the wax figures done from life of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and Benjamin Franklin and George Washington. And she was known for her hyper-realism, so we would have seen, Thomas Jefferson's pimple and John Adams' fat belly, and all the things that get somewhat airbrushed out by Trumbull et al. Later in time. So I so wish that could happen, but your question is making me thinking, could we make that happen through 3D printing? That would be amazing.
Thank you so much. This is a great talk. And actually, there's an example not using AI, but a colleague Ada Ferrer did this exhibit around Aponte, who had descriptions of paintings, and that would be another very interesting thing, which is to invite maybe contemporary artists to kind of read about these things and then revision them, including that just throwing that out there could be really interesting. But I was curious, it feels to me that you're also kind of helping to reinterpret the American Revolution itself, or kind of offering maybe a different way of thinking about political culture and art, and how we might think of these kind of histories that in some ways are very codified, but you're also suggesting there's maybe a lot to reopen and ask differently. And I just was curious if you had some thoughts about how the work kind of helps us more broadly rethink the American Revolution.
Yeah, definitely. So, scholars have often discussed the fact that, at least by this point in time, that this was a civil war as well as a revolution, right? And this definitely, I think, brings that out, this book brings that out, not just in the North American context, but in the British context as well. Because, you do see these active pro-American voices throughout the duration of the war, despite the fact that there's this Treason Act on the books. And so one of the things I think this book does contribute to is our understanding of this as a global civil war, not just, a North American-centric civil war. I also think that it helps remind us again that, Abigail Adams is not a one-off. There are lots of women and girls who are actively participating in politics. Lauren, your new book will tell us sometimes unwillingly, but also willingly. And I think Prince Dima is a really good example of this too, because one of the things I discuss in the book is the fact that I think that it was he who painted Phyllis Wheatley's portrait rather than Scipio Moorhead. The Painter's Fire is taken from in an homage to the Phyllis Wheatley poem To S.M., a Young African Artist on First Seeing His Works. And the line in there is the poets and the painter's fire. And what I'd like to use, the reason that I bring up the fact that I think Prince Dima may have painted the portrait instead is that we'll never know the answer to this unless some, wild documentation comes out that no one is looking for. But I think it's really astounding to think of the fact that there is, in the early 1770s, not one, not two, but three enslaved people who are widely acknowledged around the British Empire to be creative geniuses. And so we really need to stop thinking about talented enslaved people as unique, right? They're extraordinary, but they're not unique. And so that's one of the reasons I like to dwell on that. So I hope that this also contributes to the broader historiography of remembering that there are these people, that Abigail Adams is not an outlier, and that Phyllis Wheatley's not an outlier, and that we've sort of tended to treat their stories as unique, and we shouldn't be. That this is a revolution that is diverse, and patriots are cosmopolitan and geographically expansive. And I hope that this is one of the takeaways from the book, because we tend to think of loyalists as fitting this bill, but not so much patriots, and I think that we really should. The race.
Thank you, thank you. I'm just curious. After watching Ken Burns' 12 hours of the docuseries, it really came very vividly to me that there was not just one war going on, but at least two wars. The Patriots against the Revolutionary, against King George III, and yet also the settlers against the indigenous.
Yeah.
They were, taking the land away from them, taking them away, blah, blah, blah. It's a lot of conflicts there for me, a lot of contrasts. King George protected them, telling the rebels, quote unquote, or the patriots not to, and all that. I doubt it, but I'm just wondering if any artist painted anything regarding that kind of dynamic, that contrast and all that, anything that refer to that or have bear any reference to that. I
Yeah,
doubt it
that's-
myself because given the tenor of the time, okay, that's my question.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of indigenous people in particular, and you're correct, and the same is true. This is one of the reasons why Prince Dima's story is so interesting, because the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, I think, puts it very succinctly, freedom often came with a red coat, right? So you had a better shot at gaining your freedom if you went to the British lines than to the American lines if you were an enslaved person. And similarly, one of the reasons that more indigenous people fought with the British than with the Americans was, again, and we all know the long, sad story of what happens in terms of land dispossession once the United States comes to be. I'm trying to think of, and maybe you could think, since you do British art, but it's interesting because there are some sensitive and I think wonderful depictions of indigenous people who visit London, for example, on diplomatic missions. And we know that Benjamin West, who is a character in this book, but a side character, we know that Benjamin West had a whole cache of North American indigenous artifacts, clothing, moccasins, beaded bags, et cetera, that he used in paintings and portraits. And so on the one hand, there is that sort of sensitivity to that and the wanting to, but it's also very much in the trope of the noble savage, right, which is troubling on its own account. And then if you think about Patience Wright, for example, she's definitely using indigenous figures in her wax museum, but she's using them in the same way that Paul Revere puts an indigenous person in his political cartoons to represent America, or Europeans have been putting, American indigenous figures with feathers and half-clothed or unclothed on cartouches of maps for centuries to show European claims to possession of, American territory. So even when you do see depictions, but I don't think that I think it's very much of the moment that the best case you have among these artists is noble savage, which is problematic in and of itself.
Yeah, I mean, there are some portraits that there were the three Cherokee chiefs who visited England in 1762 and London in 1762, and there's lots of portraits, some of them more serious than others, most of them kind of in the print culture kind of realm. There's the wampum that trades hands between Native American tribes and colonists as documenting. I mean, there's the kind of material cult. You would have to search in the material culture realm, right? Rather than the representation realm for trying to actually thinking about agency and exchange and actual attempts at treaties at this very conflictual moment. Seems a great question.
Who was your role model when writing this book?
Ooh, such a great question, which I have not thought of. So one of the teachers that I had brunch with this morning said that my book reminded me of a lot of a book that I hadn't even heard of, which is kind of embarrassing to admit because apparently it won a Pulitzer Prize. So I guess there's a limit to everyone's knowledge, right? So she said it reminded her of this book, Horse. So that's something maybe to compare, which is now on my to read list. In terms of, I will say, one of my perennial inspirations for telling stories, forgotten histories, or telling stories about. So I will say that one of the first things I thought about when I came up with the general idea of Prince Dima, Robert Edge Pine, Patience Wright. And then I was like, well, how do I get into it? What is my starting point? And when I found out about the tarred and feathered horse, I was like, okay, this is where I start, because I think that the past is foreign and yet the same. And so I like to start with the foreignness, because I think it reminds us of what is happening in the past that is different and distinctive from ourselves today. And so the tarred and feather horse was just kind of blew my mind. And the thought process behind, let's go steal someone's horse, put an effigy on its back, tar and feather it, and send it through town to send a message to these loyalists, just kind of blew my mind, right? And so I started with the thing that didn't make sense. And in that sense, my inspiration is always Robert Darnton, The Great Cat Massacre, and other stories about 18th century France, because he similarly starts with things that make no sense to modern cultural eyes. So in this case, how many of you have read that book? Probably a number of you, right? So he starts with this thing in Paris where people put a bunch of cats in bags and drown them in the Seine, right? And you're like, what? That makes no sense. And yet he uses it to unpack French cultural history in really interesting ways. So I will say that that's a lot of it too, which has nothing to do with art, so, or the American Revolution, but there you have it. Yes, great question though. I'm gonna have to think more about that.
Well, I'll just have one more question
Sure.
to round it out then. And this is a very art history question in a way, but like it is definitely distinctive that so many of the works that you cite are gone. But you do, a lot of your illustrations are drawn from print culture,
Yes.
engravings, etchings, things like that. And so I'm just kind of curious, but the mediums that you talk about, are wax painting. And so I'm just, what's the role of print culture, visual print culture in your thinking through this period or recovering this period?
Yeah, visual print culture is huge, because without it, I wouldn't have the record of most of Robert Edge Pine's paintings.
Right, almost all.
Yeah, so for example, the one of his paintings, so he came to America, opened this, Robert Morris, the American financier, was so taken with him that he built him a bespoke mansion in Philadelphia. The entire second floor gallery was this art museum, which featured things people in America had never seen before, like a copy of the Venus de Milo, which was scandalous because she's nude. And, when Houdon brought his bust to Benjamin Franklin to America, he left it in the museum for a while so people could see it. And most people think that Charles Wilson Peale started American art museums. And at the time, Charles Wilson Peale had like a room in his house with portraits and a room in his house with, natural history specimens, kind of a thing. And this was the first time anyone had seen this grand art museum. And, it was filled with these paintings of Shakespearean scenes and things like Congress voting independence and the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and all these things that Robert Edge Pine was painting to, much as we have in the Capitol Rotunda today, right, to imagine the great scenes of the Revolution. There's only one that survives, and it survives because Edward Savage made a copy of it, and it became a print. And it's called Congress Voting Independence. Trumbull later copies it, for the basis of his famous painting, which is in the Rotunda and on the back of currency and everything else. If you look at Trumbull's, the ceilings are really high. There are velvet swagged curtains. There's an oriental rug on the floor, velvet upholstered chairs. Everyone has amazing posture and a beautifully turned calf, which in the 18th century was what a man wanted. And by contrast, if you look at Robert Edge Pine's version, it is a faithful reproduction of Independence Hall, of the interior. The ceiling's much lower. There are blinds instead of curtains. There's nothing on the floor, straight unupholstered Windsor back chairs. And, Benjamin Franklin's sort of hunched over, and people have, balding spots and some not well-turned calves. And in other words, it's a very faithful, rendering of the American Revolution. And I like to say now that Trumbull's is airbrushed, right? I love John Trumbull. This is not to knock him. Like, this is, but this is to say that we would have a very different vision, right? And so print culture is the way that we get a glimpse at that different vision than we would otherwise have. And print culture also, I think, is a reminder, and this is a question I sometimes get from audiences, and rightly so, is how much this matters. Like how much does Patience Right's Wax Museum matter when you had to be in London to see it? Or how much does a painting of Robert Edge Pine matter if you had to come to London or Bath or Philadelphia to see it? And my answer is print culture, because so many of these things got made into popular prints that circulated in magazines as standalone prints that you could buy and you could put on the wall of your house or paste in a book to look at. People in the 18th century even made folding screens and covered them with prints, right? So the fact that a lot of these artworks and the images of the artists themselves, in the case of Patience Right, were disseminated through print culture meant that this was a pop culture thing. This was not just high style art. This wasn't just you had to go to the Royal Academy to see these things. Widely circulated. And a great last example of that is that the painting of Patience Right holding the decapitated head of Charles I does not survive, and sadly it was not made into a print as far as I can tell. However, the same week that the painting went on show in the Royal Academy, these British printmakers, a husband and wife team, the Darleys, made a really cheaply produced, widely circulated print called The Heads of the State in a Right with a W, so it was like Patience Right's name, The Heads of the State in a Right situation. And it shows Patience Right standing there like this, looking up at heads on spikes on a famous building in London, and they're all the various bêtes noires of the American Revolution. And so you may not have made it to the Royal Academy to see that portrait, but you got the same message, right? And the same popular image of Patience Right being associated with decapitated heads of, America's enemies. So it's a great reminder that print culture is really what makes this pop culture. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm from Brazil, and in the political angle, there is the right-wing parties with lots of art that is made for political purpose, like portraits and other things. And they're often criticized by the left as tacky or in poor taste. I wonder if in your studies, did you find a lot of criticism, the same kind at that time of the revolution, like the revolutionary paintings or artists are tacky or in poor taste?
It's a great question because, yes, I think authoritarians in particular have terrible taste in art. Yeah, and that is a truism, I would say, yes. But in terms of whether the revolutionaries were seen as having terrible art, that's an interesting question because, of course, the art that Americans are producing is always going to be seen by British people in the British, the heart of the British Empire art scene. So people in St. Martin's Lane at the Royal Academy as less than. So this is a famous example, but I think very telling. John Singleton Copley sent, sort of like, here's what I can do portrait to Sir Joshua Reynolds in England from when he was still in Boston. And it was his Boy with the Squirrel, the famous painting. And Sir Joshua Reynolds wrote back to him and was like, essentially said, this has some promise, but you need to get out of the colonies before you ruin yourself because this is way too realistic and you need to come here where we can train you properly. So even, I think arguably that's a lovely portrait. I'm sure many of you have seen it. It's not like that's, a terrible crayon drawing or something. But that I think is really indicative of, even with a painting of that caliber, you get this British disdain. So that is certainly true. And I don't think that has anything to do with politics, though. I think that's more, an imperial lens on colonial art. In terms of the pro-American artists who are working in Britain, you don't really, I haven't really seen any attacks on their artistry per se. So it's more the political stuff. So Robert Edge Pine, for example, he won multiple awards from the Society of Artists, which is the sort of precursor and parallel organization to the Royal Society, which, by the way, he deigned to join because it was too monarchical. But so you have, he's someone who's pro-American and is given awards. So I don't know that it's an artistic distinction so much as it is a political one. But it's a great question. I'm going to go back and see if I can find anyone that I think fits that bill. But yes, authoritarian art, tacky.
Okay, one more, did you? Last question.
Actually, I'll cheat. You can choose which one. Two questions. One, maybe bringing this other question forward to today and thinking about the work that you're doing and your peers and colleagues and the comment you were making, Phyllis Wheatley, not a one-off, Abigail Adams, not a one-off. And in the artistic community, where are we in terms of thinking about who is and who isn't an artist? And, you know, in literature, we think about a canon. And I'm thinking about what that means in the world, in the artistic world. Some of the artists that you've mentioned, and the fact that we don't talk about folk art anymore, but there's a definition of who is and who isn't inside that canon. So I'm curious about that. And then as I was listening to you, it just hit me, wax. Where did it come from and where is it now? I mean, I don't think about anyone working in wax anymore. Kind of why the medium then, and what happened to that?
Yeah, so I will answer your second question. If there's time, I'll allude briefly to the last, because I think that would be a great thing to end on for us all to collectively mull over. So wax statues have been made since ancient times, right? Ancient Egyptians, ancient Romans. They were made for burial purposes, for ceremonial purposes, for spiritual purposes. In the 18th century, there was a thriving wax figure business because it was one way you could get portraits done of people, so usually profiles, but also sometimes death masks, and you could make them into wax. Royal people often had wax figures made of them that, you know, were left in effigy in places like Westminster Abbey. In fact, Patience Wright's only full-length wax figure that survives is William Pitt, the Earl of Chatham, wearing the robes in which he died on the House of the Lords floor, giving a speech about America. That is at Westminster Abbey, and it was commissioned to put there as, you know, a death memorial to him. So there is this long history. What Patience Wright did that was unusual was, and her sister, before them, wax museums tended to be sensational places. So one of the most popular exhibits that was in London, but also traveled in colonial North America, so sort of like a traveling show, traveling circus, was of the Countess of Hennenberg and her 365 children, each small as a mouse. And she had 365 children because a beggar woman asked her for assistance, and she told her no thank you, and the beggar woman cursed her. And, you know, so this was a wildly popular, you know, the Countess and her 365 mice-sized children. What Patience Wright and her sister did that was different was previously the only real people had been royal figures, and they went beyond that. They did people like Cadwallader Colden and Benjamin Franklin and George Whitefield and the sort of, you know, celebrities, sometimes living. They weren't even dead in some cases, and people who were renowned for scientific or intellectual or religious accomplishments. And so they were really popular for that reason. I think one of the reasons they were so popular was that this is before film, right? This is before photography. And I think that was the closest that 18th century people could get to a living representation. And in fact, wax was critiqued by, again, Sir Joshua Reynolds, among others, as being too realistic. It was one of the reasons that he didn't let wax figures of the type that Patience Wright made into Royal Academy shows. I think also there's a gendered component to this. A lot of the best wax makers are women, as you might have gathered from my examples. And so the Royal Academy is, you know, pretty misogynistic from the start. So not accidental that some of the art genres that women specialize in are left out of what's acceptable. The wax itself is interesting because it is beeswax. And in the 18th century, they modeled the beeswax with turpentine to keep it malleable, which, you know, recipe for extra disaster. And then it was painted. So what you'll sometimes see is someone could make a figure, for example, and call it, you know, the figure of Britannia, and then decide they want to make it an indigenous woman, and they would change the paint color on the face. So people sometimes did things like that. But the figures themselves, the hands and the head were wax. The rest of the body was an armature of wood and cloth and cardboard and dressed in real clothes. So I think you can imagine now why a lot of those figures don't survive, because that's basically, you know, a candle waiting to happen. So really interesting to think about, you know, again, it's sort of a product of empire because the turpentine is coming from colonial North America, harvested by enslaved people often. The beeswax could be coming from any number of places around the world. So very much is one of those global commodities too, that we should think about the hidden labors that go into them that are often enforced and dangerous. And in terms of contemporary art and what we think of as art, I hope that we have a more expansive view of art, because I think that I just recently saw on Instagram, so it's not very scientific, but recently saw an Instagram post that claimed that one of the things that anthropologists think set humans apart from other animal species is art, and that we are the only animal species that from the start has created art, and that art also has this effect of lifting the human spirit. And I think that's a really important thing for us to think of, because I think that we often can become very driven by art is less hard to quantify in a lot of ways, and I think it's very subjective, and one person might love a painting that another person hates. But one of the reasons that I hope we have a more expansive view of art today is that I think it's really an important thing that humanity needs, and I think that it's, again, I said this earlier, but I think a lot of art is political, and I think in times of political dissent, it can be a way for us to come together and discuss things too. So.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you.